Picture a courtyard in the Greek city of Abera, sometime in the 5th century before Christ. An old man sits cross-legged on a stone bench, a disc of polished bronze in his weathered hands. The midday sun is high and merciless. Slowly, deliberately, he tilts the mirror until it catches the light directly into his own open eyes. He does not flinch. He does not look away. Neighbors passing by will later say they saw smoke rise faintly from his face, that he sat there for what felt like an unbearable stretch of time, silent, almost serene. This was no accident, no punishment, no act of despair. It was, according to the story passed down by Roman writers centuries later, a choice made with full clarity by one of the sharpest minds the ancient world had ever produced. His name was Democritus, and by the time this moment occurred, he had already redrawn the boundaries of what the human mind believed the universe was made of. Why would a man who saw further than almost anyone in his era choose to make himself blind? The answer begins not in that courtyard, but decades earlier, on the roads leading out of Greece entirely. Democritus was born into extraordinary wealth in Abera, a prosperous trading city on the northern coast of the Aegean. His father was rich enough to have once hosted the Persian king's army, and when he died, he left his son an enormous inheritance, enough gold, by some accounts, to live in idle comfort for several lifetimes. Democritus did something almost no wealthy heir of his time would consider. He spent nearly all of it on travel and learning. He journeyed to Egypt to study with priests and geometers. He is said to have traveled through Babylon, possibly reaching the edges of Persia, absorbing astronomy, mathematics, and foreign philosophies few Greeks had ever encountered firsthand. He returned home older, poorer in coin, but staggeringly rich in knowledge, so much so that Aberan law, which allowed citizens to be prosecuted for squandering a family fortune, nearly put him on trial. According to legend, he silenced his accusers by reading aloud from his greatest work, a text so brilliant the city awarded him money instead of punishment. Whether or not that detail is exactly true, one thing was certain: Democritus had traded gold for something he considered far more valuable, the raw material of understanding itself. What made Democritus strange to his fellow citizens wasn't just his travels, it was his temperament. Where other philosophers postured with solemn gravity, Democritus laughed. He laughed often, loudly, at funerals, at marketplaces, at the pompous rituals of civic life. The people of Abera began calling him simply the laughing philosopher. Centuries later, artists would paint him grinning beside a globe, in deliberate contrast to Heraclitus, the philosopher who wept at the folly of mankind. Democritus found human ambition, greed, and vanity less tragic than absurd. Small dramas performed by short-lived creatures who mistook their brief lives for something cosmically important. But his laughter was never cruel. It came from distance, from perspective, from a mind that had trained itself to see the larger structure beneath the noise of daily human affairs. He wasn't laughing at people out of contempt. He was laughing because he had glimpsed something underneath the surface of the world. Something stranger, quieter, and far more permanent than any king's ambition or merchant's fortune. That something would eventually consume the rest of his life and lead him toward the strangest decision any philosopher of antiquity is recorded to have made. The idea that consumed Democritus was this: everything visible in the world, every stone, every tree, every human body, was made of invisible, indivisible particles moving through empty space. He called them atomos, meaning uncuttable. Atoms, he proposed, came in endless shapes and sizes, colliding and combining to form all matter, while empty void allowed them room to move. There was no divine hand shaping events, no mystical substance behind reality, only atoms and void, forever in motion. This was staggering for its time. 2,000 years before microscopes, before any tool existed that could confirm or deny it, Democritus had reasoned his way toward the basic architecture of modern physics using thought alone. But here lay the deep irony of his life's work. The very thing he believed was most real, the atom, could never be seen. Not by him, not by anyone, not with any eye that had ever existed or would exist for 2 more millennia. He had built an entire vision of the universe around something fundamentally invisible to human sight. And slowly, this contradiction began to weigh on him more than anyone around him could understand. As Democritus grew older, he grew increasingly convinced that the senses were unreliable narrators of truth. Color, taste, sound, these were not properties of atoms themselves, he argued, but effects created in the observer. Sweetness did not exist in honey, it existed in the tongue that tasted it. The world people believed they perceived directly was, in his view, a kind of convention, a shared hallucination built from atomic collisions interpreted by fallible organs. This belief created a strange tension in his daily life. He wanted, more than anything, to think clearly about the hidden structure of reality. Yet his eyes kept pulling his attention back toward the surface of things, toward the marketplace, toward passing faces, and, according to the account later recorded by the Roman statesman Cicero, toward the beauty of women in his city, which he found distracted his concentration more than he wished to admit. For a mind devoted entirely to uncovering the invisible order beneath the visible world, this pull of the senses had become, in his own words, an obstacle. The very organ that let him navigate daily life was, he believed, actively working against the deeper work of his mind. So Democritus made his decision. Cicero, writing centuries later in his work on ethical boundaries, records the tradition plainly. Democritus deliberately extinguished his own eyesight, staring into strong reflected sunlight until his vision was destroyed, precisely so that his mind would no longer be interrupted by the pull of appearances. He wanted, in Cicero's words, to devote his thoughts entirely to reflection, freed from the distraction of sight. It was not an act of madness but, in his own understanding, an act of radical discipline. If the eyes could not be trusted to reveal truth, and if they constantly dragged attention toward fleeting, shallow things, then removing them entirely might finally allow the deeper faculty of reason to work undisturbed. It is a story that unsettles modern listeners precisely because it inverts our assumptions. We treat sight as our most precious sense, the primary gateway to knowledge. Democritus treated it, at least in this account, as a leash, something binding his attention to the surface of the world when he wanted, more than anything, to descend beneath it. Whether the details are exact or symbolic, the philosophy behind the act was unmistakably serious. News of a wealthy, world-traveled philosopher blinding himself spread quickly through Abdera, and not everyone believed his reasoning was sound. Many assumed grief, illness, or outright madness. The city council, worried about the mental state of one of their most famous citizens, is said to have sent for the most respected physician in the Greek world at the time, Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine. This detail alone tells us how seriously the ancient world took the incident. This was not a private oddity whispered about in back alleys, but a civic concern significant enough to summon the greatest medical mind of the age. Hippocrates traveled to Abdera expecting, based on the reports he had received, to find a man broken by delusion, perhaps raving, perhaps dangerous to himself. Instead, when he arrived at Democritus's home, he found something entirely different. A scene so calm, so methodical, that it would completely upend the diagnosis he had been sent to deliver. Hippocrates found Democritus seated in his garden beneath a fig tree, surrounded by the carcasses of small animals he had been carefully dissecting by touch, calmly narrating his observations about their internal organs to a scribe nearby. He was not weeping, not raving, not lost in confusion. He was working, methodically, precisely, with the same rigor he had applied his whole life. When Hippocrates asked him directly why he had destroyed his own sight, Democritus reportedly answered without hesitation. The visible world, he explained, was full of distraction, bright colors, passing beauty, the constant flicker of appearances competing for attention. None of it, he insisted, brought him closer to the truth he sought. If anything, it pulled him away from it. By closing off his eyes, he had opened, in his words, the eye of the mind, a faculty he believed could examine causes, principles, and hidden structures far more clearly once it was no longer distracted by surfaces. Hippocrates listened, examined him carefully, and found no sign of the madness the city had feared. The philosopher's reasoning was strange, even extreme, but it was entirely coherent, deliberate, and, in its own way, disciplined beyond anything the physician had encountered before. According to the tradition, Hippocrates returned to the council of Abdera and delivered a verdict no one expected. Democritus, he said, was not insane. If anything, he was the sanest man in the city, a mind so disciplined that it had chosen permanent physical sacrifice in pursuit of clarity, while the rest of the city chased fleeting pleasures and shallow disputes without ever questioning where their attention was going. The people who had sent for a doctor to examine a madman found themselves, instead, quietly examined in return. It is worth pausing here on the irony history handed down. A city worried about one man's judgment ended up being gently indicted by a physician for its own lack of self-reflection. Whether this exact exchange occurred as told, or was shaped and polished by later writers eager for a good story, its function remained the same for the ancient audiences who repeated it. It asked a pointed question that had nothing to do with eyesight at all. Who, truly, is more blind? The man who removes his eyes to think without distraction, or the crowd that keeps its eyes wide open yet never uses them to look inward? There is a deeper layer to this story that goes beyond the drama of self-blinding, and it lies in Democritus's own physics. Remember what he believed the universe was made of: atoms, moving through void, invisible to any eye that had ever existed. In a strange sense, Democritus had always been chasing something no human vision could ever perceive directly. His theory of matter was never going to be confirmed by looking harder at the world. It required looking past it, using reason to infer a hidden order beneath appearances that no amount of staring could ever reveal. His physical blindness, whether literal fact or symbolic legend, mirrors exactly what his philosophy had already been arguing for decades: that the truest structure of reality lies beneath what the eyes report, and that clinging too tightly to appearances can actually prevent someone from grasping what is real. In this light, the story of his blinding becomes less a bizarre historical footnote and more a vivid, almost theatrical illustration of the very metaphysics he spent his life developing. A man enacting, with his own body, the deepest claim of his mind. It's worth being honest here about the historical uncertainty surrounding this story. Cicero reports it, and later writers repeat it, but some ancient scholars, including Diogenes Laertius, question whether Democritus was ever truly blind at all, noting other accounts describing him observing the world well into old age. The story may be partly legend, shaped over centuries by admirers who wanted a vivid parable for a man whose ideas about invisible atoms and unreliable senses already unsettled his contemporaries. But even if we treat it as legend rather than literal biography, its power hasn't diminished with time. Ancient audiences did not repeat this story because they were certain it happened exactly as told. They repeated it because it captured something true about attention, distraction, and the cost of insight, something they recognized in their own lives, long before anyone had a name for information overload or divided attention. A story doesn't need to be forensically verified to carry real philosophical weight. Sometimes the most instructive tales are the ones a culture chooses to keep alive precisely because they illuminate a tension every generation has to face on its own terms. Now step back into the present. Almost no one today would consider physically blinding themselves for clarity of thought, and Democritus's method should never be taken literally. But the underlying problem he wrestled with has, if anything, grown far more urgent. We now carry screens that flood our eyes with more images in a single hour than an ancient citizen of Abera might have encountered in a month. Notifications, advertisements, endless scrolling feeds, all competing for the same visual attention. Democritus considered his greatest obstacle to deep thought. We haven't solved his problem, we've simply industrialized it. Where he had to actively resist the pull of a marketplace or a passing face, we now live inside environments deliberately engineered to capture and hold our eyes for as long as possible. The tension Democritus felt in ancient Abera, between the shallow pull of appearances and the deeper work of reasoning, has become the defining struggle of modern attention itself. His extreme solution feels almost quaint next to the scale of distraction most people now navigate simply by opening their phone in the morning. So what can we actually take from this story and put into practice today without needing bronze mirrors or sacrificing our sight? The insight Democritus was reaching for is this: real thinking requires protected space away from the pull of appearances, and that space rarely happens by accident. It has to be deliberately built. Today, try this. Choose one block of time, even just 20 minutes, and remove all visual input entirely. Put the phone in another room, close your eyes or sit facing a blank wall, and simply think through one problem you've been avoiding without any screen, image, or notification competing for your attention. Do this daily if you can. Call it, if you like, your own small version of Democritus's discipline, not destroying your sight, but temporarily setting it aside, so the quieter part of your mind, the one built for reasoning rather than reacting, finally gets a turn to work. Democritus believed the deepest truths were invisible to the eye. 2,000 years later, in a world louder and brighter than he could have imagined, that belief has never been more worth testing for yourself.